Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Nu lob mein Seel den Herren, which translates to, Now praise my soul the Lord. We've looked at this text quite a bit in the past. This is another harmonization of that same melody that's associated with the text. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. There's quite a bit to talk about in this chorale. It is a two-pager, so we have no key signature. We start on C major and we end on C major. So I think the overall tonality of this chorale is C major, which is always nice because it makes it easier to read. Passing seventh in the bass, and then we have A, E, A, and C, which is our sixth chord, A minor. Then we have E, E, G, and B. That's our three chord, E minor. A bit of transitive harmony here. Typically 3 goes to 6, but here we're seeing it the other way around. Passing seventh in the tenor, and then we get F, C, G, and A. This G is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. This is a 4 chord, F major. It's interesting to see a 9/8 suspension over a non-tonic functioning chord, but we do see them from time to time. And then we go to C major again, C, C, E, and G. Tonic triad, root position, passing tones in the alto and the bass before we get E, C, G, and C, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral there. Then we have F, C, A, and D. D minor 7 over F. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. G is a non-chord tone, B is a non-chord tone, G is a non-chord tone. That's a little passing 5 chord to complete our imperfect authentic cadence. C major, C, C, G, and E. Tonic triad root position. Next phrase continues in the key of C major. We end with a perfect authentic cadence. We start off with another C major chord, C, C, G, and E. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral or reanalyze. Passing tone in the tenor. And then we have C, E, G, and E. No need to reanalyze again. We have F, we have A, and we have D as well with the C in the bass. It's like we have a 2-4-2 chord happening here. And here's a pretty cheeky chord progression that Bach uses. It's not really an irregular resolution because 2-4-2 is going to some type of chord with the G in the bass, but it's kind of interesting how the Roman numerals end up working out, because we have not a G natural in the bass, but rather a G sharp in the bass. And actually, what am I talking about? No, this is an irregular resolution. We would expect C to go down to B in the bass. The fact that we're seeing G sharp it is unusual, but we would expect G to be sort of the object of focus from a root perspective in this chord, but we're seeing G sharp, which is the third of this E major chord. This would be 5-6 of 6, another sort of intermediary chord in a transitive progression. Typically we would expect to see 6 here, A minor. This is a passing seventh as well, A, C, A, and E. 6 go to 2, but here we see 2 go to 5-6 of 6. That's kind of a quirky progression, and it's most definitely an irregular resolution of a 4-2 chord. Typically Bach resolves 4-2 chords down by step, and the roots are typically a fifth apart down, so 2 typically would go to 5, but here we see 2 going to 6. So they are a fifth apart, just a fifth up rather than a fifth down. And it's another sort of transitive progression here, with the secondary dominant being, like I said, an intermediary chord between the two chords that are against the grain of the cycle of falling fifths. So you could use the same voice leading to get from one chord to the other and flip the order, but typically we expect the relationship of most chords that are a fifth apart to be a fifth below rather than a fifth above. That's just the general trend, but we see Bach break that trend all the time. Passing seventh in the bass, we then have F, C, A, and D. That's D minor over F, which is 2-6. A little passing chord happening here with G in the bass, B, G, and D, which is like a passing 5 chord, just like we saw here on the end of our cadence, or like the beat before our final cadential chord in the previous phrase. We would expect this to go to C major, which it does. E, C, G, and C. Tonic triad, first inversion. F, A, D and C is like a little passing 2-6-5 chord, D minor 7 over F. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. We then have G, B, G, and D, which is our 5 chord G major, with a passing 7th of the alto, and of course we cadence on our tonic, C, G, E, and C. C major, root position. Alright, moving into the next section, we have a modulation to the key of A minor. We end with the perfect authentic cadence. We have one of these chromatic baseline modulations too, which always sort of straddles the line between whether we modulate with a common chord at the beginning of it or whether we modulate after the secondary dominant. I think they're both valid outlooks on where the modulation occurs. We'll talk about it when we get there. So we start off with another C major chord, no need to reanalyze. We then have F major, F, A, F, and C. That's our 4 chords still. A little passing tone in the alto, and then we get C, G, C, and E, which is our tonic triad in root position. We have some passing tones in the lower voices, which actually coincidentally gives us an F major 7 chord. We've seen this pattern quite a bit in Bach, where Bach will harmonize with this passing tone here in the bass, and it'll turn from a C major chord into an F major 7 chord because it has that C and that E in common. That'll typically take us to 5, G major, G, B, G, and D, which is our dominant. And I'm going to say that this is our modulation point to the key of A minor. It starts off by being a common chord, the subtonic 7th, that serves as a predominant, like a stable departure point that'll then take us to our dominant and establish the key of A minor. A little passing 7th in the alto. Then we get G sharp, B, E, and E, which is 5-6, E major over G sharp. Then that's going to take us to A minor, A, B, E, and E, which is our tonic triad, of course, with the 9/8 suspension over the bass. It's a common thing for Bach to do, the 9/8 suspension over the bass, or I guess this is a 2-1 suspension over the bass because this is a unison. Then we get a 4-3 suspension over the bass with E, G sharp, E, and B. It's our 5 chord, E major, and then we cadence on A minor, A, C, E, and A. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase takes us to the key of G major, fairly straightforward phrase where G is our common chord. Not G, A minor is our common chord, A, C, E, and A. Tonic triad, don't need to reanalyze in the key of A. It is our 2 chord in the key of G though. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor as well before we get F sharp, A, D, and D, which is our 5 chord first inversion. D major over F sharp, passing 7th in the melody before we get G, G, D, and B. Tonic triad, root position, passing 7th in the bass, E, G, G, and C. It's our 4 chord, C major in first inversion. C is a chord tone, E is a chord tone, B is a passing 7th, so the chord does briefly turn into root position and adds a 7th there, so I will mark that as a little respelling of the same chord, functionally speaking. That takes us to 5, D, D, F sharp, and A, D major, root position, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase is pretty interesting actually. We're going to end in the key of F major, but F major is going to be sprung on us at the last second, and this is going to reintroduce a type of cadence that we haven't seen in a while. We are technically in the key of F major based on the way that I hear it, but it also kind of feels like we've never left the key of C major, and we're just getting this sort of modal 7th in there, and I've been calling it, at least in my previous analyses, I've been calling it a subdominant cadence, where it feels like we're cadencing on the 4 of the scale, and this one's made a little bit more obvious by the fact that we have the B flat, but in previous cases we've seen Bach do this without introducing the modal 7th, and the modulation not feeling as solidified. So yeah, this is an interesting type of cadence, and we do get a mid-phrase modulation where we go back to the key of C and then we go to the key of F. So we start with G major, but with this F natural passing in the bass. it's pretty evident that we have moved to the key of C in the same way that the previous phrase we had a chord that functioned as our pivot into the next key, and we didn't need to reanalyze because it was, a repetition of the previous chord we saw. We don't have to reanalyze in the key of G, but it is our 5 chord in the key of C. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor. We then get E, G, G, and C. Tonic triad first inversion, C major, passing tone in the alto. We then have A, C, E, and C, which is our submedian A minor, passing 7th in the bass. We then have F, C, A, and D, D minor 7 over F. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts, but this phrase is sort of prolonged a bit and it restates C in a different context like I was talking about earlier. D is a chord tone, F is a chord tone, we don't need to mark either of them. We then get G major, G, B, G, and D, 5 chord. That takes us to C major, C, C, G, and E. For all intents and purposes, this would be the point where you would sort of expect a phrase to cadence, but we get 2 extra beats, which Bach then recontextualizes the key of F major, or C major in a F majorly light, I guess. So I do think this is our 5 chord in the key of F major. F is a neighbor tone, D is a neighbor tone, C, B flat, G, and E is a fully voiced 5-7 chord with a couple of delayed, or I guess brief passing tones on the end of the beat in the bass. C, E is actually a chord tone, so I don't need to mark that. But yeah, 5-7 chord, and then we have an imperfect authentic cadence here in the key of F, where we cadence on 1, F major, F, A, F, and C. So an interesting cadence where Bach turns, or I guess flips the script and takes something that feels like C major and turns it into F major. And I think this might just be the nature of visiting the key of the subdominant, but something about Bach doing it right at the last minute. It's kind of, there's sort of a trend of Bach doing that, where if he's modulating to the key of the subdominant, it'll happen near the end of the phrase like this. Not always, but these cadences, they hit different. But we're moving to the next phrase, and this is where we go flip the page as well. We end with a cadence in the key of D minor. It happens to be perfect authentic, but I'll flip the page when I get there. But the modulation does occur on this page. We're going to stay in the key of F major to go to D minor. We have E, C, G, and C, which is our 5 chord in first inversion. And then we get a deceptive progression to D minor, D, D, F, and D. Root position, no 5th, 3 roots, and a 3rd. That's our 6 chord, and then we're going to our tonic. That's what I was trying to say. We have some passing tones in the inner voices as well. And that takes us to another D minor chord in root position. We have D, F, A, and F, so we don't need to reanalyze the Roman numeral there. And then we're going to go to page 2. Straight out my pages real quick, and also flip over in my notes. I have all of my reading material here so that I can go through the analysis pretty smoothly. And this is a perfect authentic cadence, like I said. We then have G, G, B flat, and E. That's E diminished in root position. Or sorry, it can't be half diminished, because half diminished requires a 7th. This is just 2-6. B flat's a chord tone. D is a neighboring 7th. You could make the argument this is a 2-6-5 if you're sort of looking at the whole context of the beat. But I think 2-6 is fine, and calling that D a neighboring 7th is totally sufficient. That takes us to our 5 chord, A, C sharp, E, and E, A major. And that takes us to D minor. D, A, F, and D, tonic triad, root position. Next phrase gives us a bit of a development on the cadence that we heard prior to the one we just analyzed. We do go to the key of F. It is an imperfect authentic cadence, but unlike the previous iteration where we hear the B flat right at the end, we hear B flats pretty much at the middle of the phrase, moving towards the end of the phrase as well, so it's kind of interesting. And as far as analysis is concerned, maybe subtracts a little bit from the idea that this is more of a subdominant cadence and rather just a quick cadence where we see a modulation at the end. Something about moving to the key of the subdominant at the end of the phrase, though, feels different in comparison to when Bach does that with other keys like the relative minor. But regardless, we're going to start in the key of C major, and I do think this is a direct modulation. Something about B flat and then moving to G major. G major can be diatonic to the key of D minor depending on the context, but because we have G major here and it's not really operating as a chord in a like melodic minor context, I don't think that it's functioning as a common chord in this context. I guess to be fair, G going to C would be 4 going to 7, but G with the B natural rather than the B flat I don't think makes as much. It makes sense, it's just not something we would expect. It doesn't necessarily fit the common narrative, and it really does feel like this is a 5-to-1 progression in the key of C major rather than a 4-to-7 progression in the key of D minor. But you could analyze it that way. I think it makes sense because by the time we hear this B natural in conjunction with this C natural, sort of, they're kind of coinciding with one another. I think that we will have modulated by that point. So I'm just going to call it a direct modulation. G major here, G, B, G, and D is our 5 chord. And that takes us to C major, which is our 1 chord, C, C, G, and E, with a passing 7th in the bass. And then we see an interesting progression here where we have some like falling thirds, like a thirds-based progression, which is not the most common, but we've definitely seen it in Bach, so it's not unprecedented by any means. We have A, C, A, and E. It's A minor in root position, that's our 6th chord, passing 7th in the bass, F, D, A, and F. Apologies, this is not a falling thirds progression, this is a 2-6 chord. I made a mistake in my notes. 6 going to 2 is a much more normative root-based movement, but 6 going to 4 in root position is kind of like going to a 2-6 chord. The only difference being is D rather than C. So yeah, 6 going to 2, not the biggest deal in the world, but I do think this is where we modulate to the key of F major because we're seeing B flat on the next beat. We also have a passing tone in the bass, so this is going to be 6-6, and then we go to D, D, B flat, and F, which is a 4 chord in first inversion. So 6 going to 4, we have 1 going to 6, and then 6 going to 4 in F major terms. So I guess in a roundabout way we do continue the chain of thirds based relationships between the chords next to one another. 4-6 is going to keep us in the key of F major. We have C 7 after that, C, E, B flat, and G. F is a non-chord tone, E is a chord tone, D is a non-chord tone, and that takes us to D minor, so a deceptive progression to lead us into our cadence. D, C, A, and F, more specifically 6-7, D minor 7, and then we get a passing chord here. We have E, B flat, G, and G, which are all non-chord tones, and when 4 voices move off the harmonic rhythm, typically there's a subdivided chord progression happening, pretty much always. This is a root position 7 chord that then takes us to F major. F, A, F, and C. Tonic triad. So another interesting F major cadence here with 6-7-1. Can't say I've seen too many 6-7-1 progressions here. But, you know, it is a fascinating cadence, and when Bach interjects with these F major ideas in this particular chorale, they are very interesting. I feel like Bach is sort of forcing an F major perspective on an otherwise C major oriented melody, so yeah. Alright, next phrase is going to take us to the key of G major, so we have some distant modulation here. F to G is 2 notches on the cycle of fifths. We then have C major here, C, C, G, and E, which is our 5 chord in the key of F, but with this B natural in passing, it's operating as 4 in the key of G. We then have F sharp in the bass, A, and D. It's D major over F sharp, that's a 5-6 chord with a passing 7th in the melody, D major over F sharp, and that takes us to G major, G, D, G, and B. Kind of similar to a progression we saw on the first page where we had that secondary, that 4/2 irregular resolution a little bit. It kind of reminds me of that shape in the bass. That's our tonic triad and root position. We then have C major over E, E, G, G, and C. It's 4/6. And similar to what we saw earlier, some point on the first page, we have the C major chord turning into a root position 7 chord. C, G, E, and B. So I'll go out of my way to mark that because it's kind of interesting seeing a respelled, reinverted, fully voiced 7 chord. That takes us to 5, D, D, F sharp, and A. It's our 5 chord, D major, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G, tonic triad, root position. Next phrase, I think, takes us to the key of C major, and we end in a half cadence, but this F sharp here is part of a chromatic bass line that, starts with this E here and goes all the way up to A and spans, more than just one phrase. So I think there's an argument to be made that this is also an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, because that F sharp does kind of throw you for a loop and brings into question whether or not the chord that we're looking at is functioning as a primary dominant or a secondary dominant. But I hear it as a half cadence. I don't know, this D wants to resolve down to C, and even though we have some secondary dominance going on here, in my opinion, that doesn't keep me from feeling it's in the key of C. But regardless, we have G, B, D, and G. No need to reanalyze. A, E, A, and C. It could be an A minor chord. I think this is actually F sharp diminished, F sharp, A, and C, which makes a little bit more sense as our 7 chord in first inversion. And typically when we see a 7 chord in first inversion with a 1 chord on the other side, we see the inversion of the 1 chord on the other side. So in this case, it'll be first inversion, B, G, D, and B. 1/6, which I also think coincides with our modulation to C major. It's now 5/6. We have some passing tones in the lower voices, I think. We then have D, D, F natural, and A. So we have F sharp here and F natural here. It's kind of an interesting sound, but seeing D minor contextualized after a G major chord means that we've moved to the key of C major most likely. So this is now operating as our 2 chord. And here I think is my favorite progression in the entirety of the chorale. It's really, really cool. I think this is the first time we've run into a progression like this. So 2 takes us to, I think it takes us to C major over E, where this D is a 7/6 suspension over the bass. E, C, G, and G. And if you've watched my videos in the past, you might be familiar with my opinion on 2-to-1 progressions. 2 typically doesn't go to 1. It could be a 3/7 chord. It's very possible this is E minor 7 without the 5th. It's, I think, a valid analysis. But I think this is a 7/6 suspension over the bass. And 2-to-1, it's a relatively uncommon progression. I think this one's, it's a little bit more sensible just because of the fact that we have 2 going to 1 in first inversion. So it's not like 2 going to 1 in the bass. Typically, we approach the 1 chord from, I guess, from below in the bass. That makes a little bit more sense. It doesn't necessarily matter the direction that it gets approached in the bass. 2 going to 1 is not a very common plagal progression in Bach. We do see it from time to time, but it's one of the lesser common chords that we see move to 1. But what's really interesting is that we have 2 going to 1/6. And what do we have here on the next beat? We have 2/6, F, C, A, and D. This is a really interesting progression because I guess hypothetically speaking, this could be a 7 chord, right? It does make sense from this perspective where 3/7 going to B minor 7 flat 5 over F does make sense. 7 typically wants to go to 3, but transitively they have that same relationship where they're next to one another in the cycle of fifths. So it makes sense that you would go from one to the next. But if we look at the F here, sorry, not the F, the C with the A and the D, this is D minor 7 over F, 265. And we know that Bach loves 265 chords, especially in cadential contexts. But yeah, 2, 1, 6, 2, 6. Typically, we see a pattern that involves 1 and 1, 6 with 7, 6 in the middle, but this is an illustration of the fact, in my opinion, that Bach uses this pattern for other chords as well. Here we see 2, 1, 6, 2, 6. We've seen 3, 4, 6, 3, 6 in the past as well as 4, 5, 6, 4, 3, 6, 4, 6 as well. We've seen pretty much every enumeration, maybe except for 7 chords now. Configuration of those chords, where we have 2 similar chords on the outside of the pattern, and the chord that bridges it together is a first inversion spelling of the chord that's a diatonic step below. So 2 going to 1, it makes sense that 1, 6 is being voiced in this situation. Of course, you could also analyze it with the secondary analyses as well, depending on what you hear as the root. And for me, this is what makes sense. The primary analysis is how I hear it. So this B is a neighbor tone, and I hear this F sharp as a secondary leading tone to our dominant on the first beat of the next measure. We have F sharp, C, A, and E, which would make this F sharp minor 7 flat 5. Root position, that would make that 7 7 of 5. B is a non-chord tone, C is a chord tone, so we can leave that unmarked. That takes us to G major. G, B, G, and D. Of course, you could say this D minor 7 chord is our 6th chord. If we move to the key of G major, it doesn't really make a lot of sense that we have the F natural at this point. It would have to be some type of interesting modulation, but I'm sure you could figure it out. There's not really a... Actually, what you could say is that it's C, or this F natural was... I guess this B could be 7 7 of 4, and Bach was just creating a progression of secondary 7 chords, or 7 7 of 4 that doesn't resolve to 4. Instead, it just goes to 7 7 and skips the 4, because its dominant sort of implies that the 4 chord would be there in the first place. But I think that that's a bit more of a stretch than this analysis here, which keeps us in the key of C major, which is how I hear this phrase anyways, and by extension the rest of the chorale. So in our last phrase, we have another interesting secondary deceptive progression here, and we end with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major. We have G sharp, E, B, and E. E major over G sharp is the dominant of 6, A minor, and instead of taking us to A minor, we get a deceptive progression. Like I said, we go to F major over A, C, A, and F, which is 4, 6. So the bass makes sense. The leading tone resolves in the bass, but we resolve to 6 in A minor terms. But in a roundabout way, in terms of C, this is 5 of 6 going to 4. So that's pretty cool. Passing tones in the lower voices, we know that 4, 6 going to 1 in root position always has this leading tone, or virtually always has this leading tone. We have seen one instance where we don't see the leading tone connecting the 2 voices, but we have B, D, A, and F, which is B minor 7 flat 5. 4 going to 7 is a very common subdivided chord progression in the chorales. That takes us to C major. C, E, G, and E. Tonic triad, root position. We have F and A as passing tones here, which does give us a bit of an F major 7 chord over C, so that would be 4, 4, 3. And that takes us to F, G, B, and D. This is a very curious chord. I think this F is an accented non-chord tone, which coincidentally makes this passing F a non-chord tone as well. So I think this is just a 5 chord, namely because if this were a 5-4-2 chord, which the F being in the bass would imply, it doesn't resolve the way we would expect, and as we saw earlier in the chorale, 4-2 chords don't always resolve the way that we would expect, but I think something we could always count on them doing is resolving down by step, or not necessarily down by step, but just downwards in general, and I think this F is just kind of creating counterpoint where we have this sort of 9 turning into a 7 in the bass, and Bach sort of flips the voices sometimes in the bass over the span of 2 beats sometimes, depending on how it's spelled. So I really think this is more just like a 5, maybe a 5-7 chord, and this F is more of a coincidence than anything else. It's not really having an impact on the harmony that 3rd inversion 7 chords typically do. So include the 5-4 or the 4-2 figured bass if you wish. I don't think it's super essential to this chord. But that takes us to A minor. So we have another deceptive progression here. A, E, C, and C. And then we have F and D going on here, which does give us a 2 chord in 2nd inversion, D minor 7 over A. So 2, 4, 3, 6 going to 2, very normative progression. And that's going to take us out. We would expect this to go to a 5 chord, but as an accessory to our 5 chord, we get our tonic triad in 2nd inversion. G, G, C, and E. A little neighbor tone here in the bass. Before we get G, G, B, and D. 1, 6, 4 is typically accommodated by 5, or not accommodated, accompanied by 5. A little delayed passing 7th here in the tenor before we cadence on C major, which is our tonic triad and root position. C, E, G, and C. And that is today's chorale. A relatively long chorale real estate-wise, but all in all, fairly straightforward. Not too much to write home about. There are a couple of things that are worth noting though, and the longer the chorale is, the more likely there are going to be things to pick out of the chorale as sort of unique characters of its profile. This 4-2 resolution here is kind of interesting. It's not the way we would expect, both in terms of root movement and in terms of bass movement as well. This cadence here in the key of F right at the end of this phrase, I've called it sort of like a subdominant cadence, and I'll put subdom here just for my own notes. Just because flipping to the key of F after being in the key of C for the whole phrase does have sort of like a unique sound to it that is peculiar and not very common in Bach. We do have a distant modulation to the key of G major from F major here, which is pretty interesting. We have this 2-1-6-2-6 progression, which I think is the first time I've ever encountered that progression. Maybe it has happened in the past and I just was not privy to it, but it's relatively uncommon to see 2 go to 1 in the first place, but it does make sense when we see it in this pattern-based context, so it's kind of cool. What else? The chromatic bass line here is also interesting. We have a couple of chromatic bass lines. We have one here with G, G sharp, and A, but then we have a more involved chromatic bass line from E all the way to A up here in the bass. Of course the bass line is in the bass, that was redundant. And we also have a secondary deceptive progression here where we have 5 of 6 going to 4, which is pretty cool. It's a pretty hip sound by Bach standards, so neat stuff. I think on those thoughts I'm going to cap the video off though. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.